the public authorities, in a sense, are also self-interested in making that happen. Because as I mentioned, by doing that, not only do you increase the quality and the comparability of the data that you collect, so effectively you reinforce your own supervisory powers, you are more omniscient, you have better data, and B, by reducing the cost on the industry, then this is more money that goes back into the system and that can be made to productive use to finance the real economy. So public authorities have a double incentive to make that happen.
Is everybody in? Good. Hey, this is Grizz Griswold, head of marketing for FINOS. Hope you're doing well. In this interview, I interviewed Leo Labeis, who's the CEO of Regnosys, one of our FINOS members. And it was a little while back, but this happened at the time where Regnosys contributed the Rune project to the CDM, or the common domain model. It was a really good interview, not just because of how stellar I was, but actually because of Leo's ability to translate the business and the technical value of the Rune project, but also how this fits into the CDM and how it fits into regulation and regtech in the first place. So I hope you enjoyed. In about a week and a half from when I'm recording this, we will have the Open Source and Finance Forum. There will be regtech there. There'll be a lot on the CDM, but I just want to make sure that I thank our sponsors, especially our leader sponsors, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, or CNCF, the FinOps Foundation, GitHub, Red Hat, Control Plane Discover, GitLab app, that's a new one, Microsoft, Open Source Climate, Sauce Labs, Sonatype, Splunk, and Temporal. And if you're watching me, yes, I'm looking at the other screen to see who all of the sponsors are. We have a great program coming up for you, not only in this podcast, but also at OSFF in New York on September 30th and October 1st. The keynotes have just been announced. The talks are phenomenal, and we're looking for well over 1,000 people there this year to break our own records for this conference. So hope you can join us, but first, enjoy this podcast with Leo and I. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Grizz Griswold of FINOS. Hope you're doing well. Today, in the recording studio, live from France, I have my friend Leo from Regnosys. Leo, how are you, sir?
I am very well. I guess you said French because my accent betrayed me, but I'm actually in the United Kingdom. Where actually that's where I'm based and the company is based.
That, you know what? As far as I know, I never knew that. I should, because I've interviewed your CTO. We've talked multiple times. It's good to know that what part of the UK are you in?
By the way, it's good that the podcasts help clear this out. Yeah, based in London and personally, and then the company is also based in the UK. We have a small R&D center in continental Europe as well.
Okay, cool. And Regnosys, what is your role at Regnosys, by the way?
So I'm the CEO founder of Regnosys, which means you can look at it in a number of ways. The first one is that I get to make all of the decisions in a dictatorial fashion. The other interpretation is that I'm good at nothing. And the last interpretation, which is actually the one that's going to occupy us today, is where I take the CTO role, or Chief Talking Officer, which is where I become a brand ambassador for the company.
Very good. Let's talk about you. Let's talk about Regnosys, and eventually we'll get to the CDM and Rune. But besides the fact that I did not realize that you were in the UK, I would love to talk to you about how you came to this position, where you started, what's your background, are you a developer, were you in the banking system? Let's go back in time for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about the Genesis story of Regnosys, and part of that is obviously is my background. So before founding the company in 2017, I made my career in Goldman Sachs in their global markets division. I was climbing up the greasy pole of the competitive bank. And for all of my 15 years of professional life, pre-Regnosys, I have worked as a financial engineer, because this is the way Goldman started to call that particular demographics in those
Mhm.
days. So essentially using financial math to price complex trades, structure deals, build tool to manage our risk. Obviously, those were involved programming and software development as well. And so when I started my career and for a period of time, capital was abundant, regulation was light, and the only limits to doing business was your own resources, your time, drive, and imagination. And then in the 2010s, we get the fallout from the 2008 crisis, and it made everything much more tightly constrained, and for good reasons. So to increase market transparency and resilience, regulatory disclosures, they expanded in size and complexity. And at the same time, you had an ever greater share of financial resources that were being channeled into shoring up the firm's balance sheets. So what that means is effectively taking money away from the system and stashing it into the financial system's piggy bank, to use an image. So suddenly, regulations became the limiting factor to doing business. And engineers, including myself, we found ourselves in a position where we did what we are trained to do when you are faced with a constraint. This is the basics of engineering. We re-engineered the firm around those constraints. And that meant putting regulation at the front, back, and center of the business to maximize the productive output under the new set of rules. And under that paradigm, it's fair to say my own role evolved from what could be called before that trading strat to increasingly regulatory strat. And for me personally, that culminated in 2016. So that's just before I founded the company. And I was put in charge of implementing what was then a new European regulation, MiFID II. Those of us who were lucky enough to be in the industry around the time will remember with a great deal of joy the amount of preparation that went into this new regulation rollout. And essentially, so while at Goldman, this is where it hit me. The firm was really efficient in running this kind of complex program, I must say. But then if you took a step back and you looked at it more broadly at the industry level, the whole approach to regulatory change, and such a massive regulatory change, was just a massive exercise in duplicating efforts across the industry. And that was not ideal at a time when the resources were getting scarce, as I just explained. Regnosys was really born as a response to the classical tale of there's got to be a better way. That's really my background and where I ended up founding the company just after that, the experience of that project.
Okay, cool. And when you were founding Regnosys, obviously we have an open source and finance crowd here. Was there any thought to how you did things? Was it open? Was it closed? How were you building at the time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the answer is open source first. And what I can do is I can tell you a little bit about, I'm going to get to describe the problem exactly.
Okay, sure.
And start to look at how we decided to solve it. And I think that's going to shed a light, hopefully, on why open source was the obvious solution.
Especially within the constraints that you had, right? Back to constraints always.
Yeah, exactly. For us, it's a means of solving a problem. And that's really important. So let's go back to the problem statement and in fact, why it's important to solve it, right?
Yeah.
So within all those rules and regulations, one in particular, and that was part of that MiFID II program, is regulatory reporting. Okay, so it's effectively large of data disclosures that financial institutions have to do and send to their regulators quarterly, monthly, daily, sometimes real time, etc.
Right.
Those are numerous and it's very costly and it's very inefficient. To put it in perspective, just orders of magnitude, but every year the industry spends several billions overall trying to comply with often complex data requirements. Now, what happens is that for every reporting regime, for every jurisdictions, firms must typically sift through hundreds or thousands of pages of legal text. And they must manually interpret and code that in their IT systems. And as a result, while many financial institutions share the same reporting obligations, they usually implement their logic in slightly different ways because of siloed technologies. So this not only exposes them to the risk of non-compliance and fines, it also means massive duplication of cost across the industry.
Right.
And to capital, it also degrades the quality and the comparability of the data that regulators collect. And in fact, increasingly, regulators are taking umbrage about that problem and really becoming stricter and stricter about enforcing data quality on those firms. And that goes back to the risk of not being compliant or not being compliant enough, and therefore being fined for poor practices and failings in terms of data quality.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
As far as if there are thousands and thousands of pages of text from the regulators, I almost want to ask like a junior question as far as, is there any guidance in what is sent off from the regulators to the banks or the financial institutions? Or is that open for interpretation, I guess?
So it's a very good question. And the short answer is yes. And in fact, there are documents that are called guidance. You have documents like technical standards, implementation standards, you name it. But essentially, once a regulation, it's a little bit like the sausage factory. First, they start as law, right? So this is being discussed within the right legislative construct that is prevalent. In the US, that would be first discussed in the context of Congress. The European level, that would be discussed at the EU level with those voted by the European Parliament. And then in other jurisdictions, those would be other national legislatures that vote text into laws. Now, obviously, because when the legislator votes this into law, so again, to go back to the 2008 crisis, and if you look at the US, when Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act, the DFA, in the wake of the financial crisis, obviously, the legislature didn't discuss each and every individual data attributes that firms were going to have to disclose on their trades to provide more market transparency. They then delegate authorities to the regulatory agencies that are then going to implement those laws. And that's where they're going to start putting more flesh on the bones on what it means from a technical standard standpoint on how they want to implement. So the similar process happens in the European institutions, where once the law gets voted by Parliament, then authorities being delegated to the relevant supervisory authority. So one of them, for instance, is a European supervisory market authority. That's where it starts to get to a second level of interpretation, and it starts to get more clarity, okay, here is the law, this is how it translates into actual requirements. And then there is a long consultation process that starts to get engaged between the regulators and the firms. And that's where some clarity is being brought to this additional set of documents, which can take the form of guidelines, technical standards. You have Q&As, and all of those are great and effectively bring clarity. But at the same time, they are all encapsulated under an analog forms. So you're going to have more and more documents that you need to sift through and interpret. To go back to solving that's open source, and open source software particularly is the obvious solution to that problem. All of those texts, interpretation, guidelines, Q&As that I described before, they are all, in a sense, open source. Anyone from the public has, or even the law where it started from, everybody has access to it. The problem is in its format. It's text and then more text and then more text and more text. So instead, if firms could develop a common code for that reporting logic that is found somewhere in the interpretation of those texts and develop that common code through some kind of industry consensus, they could build compliance implementations that are highly defensive with their regulators because effectively they are kind of the industry's best practice. And at the same time, it would reduce the massive strain on their own individual resources. So that's why, long answer to your question, that's why open source was, at least from the get-go, for us, an obvious part of the approach that had to be taken to neatly solve that problem for the industry.
Right. Because you have companies that not only have their siloed projects that are or technology that's reporting, but then you have probably different use cases per bank and everything. Eventually, like if you are sharing that information, then it's just easier to get a better consensus of how to go forward, I'm assuming.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Good. So there's the problem. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you have to sift through. And I'm also assuming from the regular side, so from the law to the regulators to the banks and any type of compliances within banks. And then you have to also, I'm sure, translate it to the engineers. How do you actually deal with that? And yeah, so I definitely see your stream of how this continues to flow downhill. And if you can mutualize a lot of that, then so how do you fix that?
Yeah, as I said, the solution is obvious.
All right.
It's to use open source. Okay,
Right.
great. Problem solved. We can all go back home. It's
We're
fine.
done.
And obviously, that's where the hard work begins. So implementing it presents significant challenges, obviously. And some of those challenges are technical and some are non-technical. So let's tackle the technical challenges first.
Okay.
And as a technology firm, this is precisely what Regnosys set out to solve. And this is where Rune comes in, which is what triggered our discussion today, which is the contribution that Regnosys has just made to FINOS.
Right.
So in short, to develop that single standardized reporting logic, you need 3 technical ingredients. Number 1, you need a standardized definition of the business data inputs that are required for reporting. So this is everything in the data that the business handles that will need to be collected that will serve to then be reported to the regulators, not necessarily under the form the business looks at it, but it's going to be an input into the process. The second thing you need is a mechanism to facilitate the mapping of a firm's own business data into this standardized set of inputs. Because if you have a sort of normalized representation of the business, then by definition, every firm will have some non-normalized way of representing their own things, and they need a straightforward way of mapping the way they are representing things in their own walled garden versus that standardized, normalized representation.
Okay.
Number 3 is you need functional logic. So think of logic that you would implement in Excel, for instance, where you do formulas and stuff. So functional logic to transform the standardized inputs into the attributes that are required by the regulators. So effectively, all the stuff that the regulatory text is giving you, but under the form of text. And essentially, the Rune language, which is the object of the contribution that we're discussing today, has been purpose-built to support all those 3 ingredients. As a data modeling language, it allows you to build those standardized definitions for all the business data and their relationships. Because the language is richly expressive, I mentioned Excel as a sort of analogy. But effectively, it means you can use the language to define what is called model-to-model mappings between a firm's own data model and the standardized one. So again, to draw an Excel analogy, you would have in one column, you would have 2 columns. In one column, you would have the way the firm represents certain attributes and how they call it. In the other column, you would have its equivalent naming and the way it's represented in the normalized model. And effectively, the one-to-one correspondence between those two columns would give you the mappings, so to speak. In practice, it's more complicated because you can't reduce it to just one-to-one mappings between fields that just have a different name, but you get the idea.
Right. It's the ontology, basically, of I think that we've seen this a couple of times, and I don't know if you're involved with the CCC, brain has gone, for the project, the standardization of naming mechanisms, basically, in cloud is something that we're working on with.
Yeah, that's exactly the same. Like, you need, on the one hand, you're defining the normalized way of doing it. Then you're also allowing individual firms to say, hey, this is how I'm mapping to that normalized representation.
And is that because of like firm legacy? Like, this is the way that we've always done it, and if we go back and try to conform right now to maybe what a regulator says that this is the standard way of doing things, then it's going to take us millions of dollars to fix it?
Yeah, I think it's born out of practicality, which is, and by the way, that normalized representation that I talked about, just for a moment, suspend any regulatory consideration from the equation, because this has nothing to do with the regulatory. We deal with how the regulators want to see the data later on. But first, this is really about a business-like representation. This is how a business person, let's say, starting from scratch, looking at the existing estate, would say, okay, this is how I'm going to build my normalized model. But then out of practicality, you can't go and tell hundreds or thousands of firms, each having many systems, to just go and replace those existing systems. Out of practicality, you need a way of making sure that firms will be able to normalize their data by mapping what they have internally, without saying, hey, you need to replace each and every of your systems to use a normalized model natively, because that's never going to work.
And now I'm starting to understand the basis of the word Rune in this as well. And previously Rosetta. Now I'm seeing the translation ability of what Rune is doing for an individual in order to get to some type of commonality.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you're right to point it out. So Rune was previously named, at least the language, Rosetta, and the reason why it was renamed Rune, just for the audience's benefits, Rune stands for Rule Natural Expression. So that goes back to the Excel analogy that I was talking about earlier. It's just a natural way of expressing both simple but also complex logic. But what it retained from the original naming Rosetta was that idea of ancient, almost primordial alphabet, and also obviously the Rosetta Stone. In the Rosetta Stone, the letters, Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphs, are in the stone, and in Rune it was also in that primordial alphabet form. Things were also carved in stone. So that's the reason why we drew that analogy. But anyway, you get the point, right? And importantly, that Rune logic, again, similar to what you would have in Excel, it's actually machine executable. When you draw formulas in Excel, it actually executes those formulas. So what that means is that those mappings that I talked about, they can be integrated into a firm's IT system, and it will physically translate and normalize those internal data. And then finally, it's the exact same language components that are used to build the standardized reporting logic. So that's where, we've suspended regulatory driver equation. Now we're putting it back on. Okay, now that our normalized model, we build a standardized reporting logic from A to B, and we effectively write all of the required regulatory attributes from the normalized data input, and that logic is also executable. I just want to make a small, just an important clarification. Technically, Rune, in fact, is not executable, or at least not yet. It can be the subject of another podcast of how we in the future intend to make it executable.
Mhm.
But just to say that the logic currently, when it's expressed in Rune, it is automatically translated into code.
Mhm.
So that's a process known as code generation. So it
Right.
translated in programming languages like Java, Scala, C#, etc., that are themselves executable.
Okay.
The advantage of that approach is that it makes the regulatory logic portable to a wide variety of technology stacks. We are not dependent on implementation choices. And it also makes that technology implementation auditable.
Mhm.
So rather than having to inspect code for validity, and often the actual business logic is obfuscated by the verbosity of usual programming languages,
Mhm.
that logic can be inspected in the more human readable language that is.
It's interesting. So glad we're having this discussion because then I think I've learned probably in the past 10 minutes more than I've learned about um, a lot of regulatory things in the past year. So keep going.
I hope your audience will see it the same way.
Oh, we'll make sure they do. Okay. Was there more on? And the other thing that, again, like, God, things are just firing now. Like, now I see that if you're not executable, then again, you can actually be sometimes more valuable as well because it goes back to the everybody has their own flavor of what they want to use. And this helps still allow them to do the things that they do quickly without having to, you know, totally change, which is something that we've definitely seen within the financial services industry, that whether it's a technology legacy issue, whether it's a dealing with the regulatory side and knowing that you can't change things because of that. Now I'm really, the lights are going on. Thank you.
But that actually brings me to the non-technical part of the challenge, which I also called the social challenge, when
Mhm.
it's the difficulty of change that you just mentioned. Before I talk about the non-technical challenge, I just wanted to say a last word about open source, just because it's so important, and obviously this is all under FINOS.
Yeah.
This open source first approach, this is not something that Regnosys had to grudgingly embrace because we were forced to or anything. It was actually there in Regnosys founding document. I'm starting to create a myth about what those are, but at the beginning, if you want to think of the bunch of slides that people had put together in a deck when the idea was starting to be pitched, that idea was there. That's what I'm calling the founding document.
Nice.
But so giving them some sort of mystical value. But the important point is we've always seen it as a prerequisite for the solution to be widely adopted. And
Mhm.
by so doing, for the company to be commercially successful as a result. And I'm insisting on that because we're not doing it either as a sort of charitable thing or the goodness of our own heart.
Right.
It's
Right.
part and parcel of our own commercial strategy on how we eventually want to be successful. And the two are synonymous. And I think it's a virtuous cycle because it means this belief is what will keep us continue to invest into that asset.
No, that makes sense. And I've said a couple of times on this podcast that the whole idea of open source is not always to be virtuous, but it is to be good. And that it's we do have to make money, but there's a lot of good that you can do, whether it's in technology systems and finance, whatever, wherever you are, that the ability to collaborate on things always makes us better. And even putting that out there in the world too makes, I think it makes other people better as well. And so that if you can collaborate even on something that's in a business setting, then it has other benefits that are maybe not seen, that are probably more on the social side. But I think that if you continue to keep that in the back of your head with your business, open source first, collaboration first, in order to, and we can still have a good time and make money and do good things. That's
I mean, here the bigger picture is that by effectively making it less onerous
Mhm.
for financial institutions to comply with rules and regulation without degrading the quality of compliance, quite the opposite, by complying better,
Right.
then effectively it means more money going back into the system.
Right.
Make loans and finance the real economy and so on. So this has actual impact on society if you can find more productive use for that money that is currently being spent on complying with all rules and regulation, again, without
Right.
degrading the quality of that compliance.
Sure. Cool. And then you can do smarter things, right?
Yeah.
It's fun. I didn't know where you wanted to go next. Like, what do you think would actually, I would like to ask this. For the Rune project, as it's been contributed, what would make it successful in your eyes? What's your definition of success for the project going forward?
Yeah. And so I think what I want to do is I want to illustrate that with where we currently are and the successes that we've started to register. And I think
Sure.
that's going to open up to how we see the future of that. And in fact, it's back to the social challenge that I mentioned earlier. How do you bring the industry together to collaborate and to codify that consensus interpretation of the rules, given the fact that this kind of strategy to build compliance as a sort of industry common, this is uncharted territory for firms. And I want to illustrate that with a familiar regulatory problem and show you the progress that has been made there.
Okay.
So that problem is the reporting of all over-the-counter derivative transaction to trade repository. So OTC or over-the-counter, which were, for better or worse, identified as one of the drivers, if not culprit, of the excesses of the pre-2000 that led to the disaster that we all went through. So G20 leaders pledged to implement this at the Pittsburgh summit that was in the wake of the financial crisis in 2009. And then within a few years, regulators had globally rolled out a version of this obligation in their reporting requirements. And at the moment, the market is going through what's known as rewrite phase. So effectively, you have one jurisdiction after another that are implementing updates and that are broadly aimed at improving global harmonization. This type of regulatory reporting, called transaction reporting, it's been a source of much industry pain, continues to be, from the cost of maintaining reporting systems to cope with ever-evolving requirements, to developing complete and accurate feeds from front office systems. And eventually, the increasingly large fines that regulators mete out for reporting failures. So this was an area that was ripe for a different approach. Incidentally, and wink to the past, there was an expensive transaction reporting requirement that was part of the MiFID II regulation that I talked about, that I was in charge at Goldman when the idea for Regnosys first started to emerge. So the technical solution, what does it look like in the context of transaction reporting? First, you need a standardized definition of the business data input. And in this case, they are over-the-counter or OTC derivative transactions. Now, describing those transactions was precisely the original purpose in life of the Common Domain Model, or CDM,
right?
Which is another FINOS flagship project. The scope has since been extended to cover other markets beyond this, but that was originally the market that it was emerged from. And specifically, changes in the transaction lifecycle are represented by so-called CDM events, and this is what drives transaction reporting. So that's number one. Number two, you need ways of translating firms' internal transaction data into CDM. Now, in the OTC derivative space, the CDM benefits from the prevalence of an existing standard called the Financial Product Markup Language, or FPML, and it's used market-wide to support transaction execution. And as a result, many firms already use FPML, or usually some variation of it, to represent their OTC derivative transaction. And this is why the CDM includes pre-built set of model-to-model mappings from FPML, the model-to-model mappings that we mentioned before. And that's maintained with every new CDM release, and firms can easily extend that. And we need to express the logic to transform those inputs so represented as CDM events, into output that the regulators want, which is a transaction report. Now, an important change that is being introduced in the current rewrite is the ISO 20022 mandate.
Mhm.
What that means is it specifies not just the attributes, but the format according to which the transaction report must be structured. And ISO 20022 is the name of such format, which is actually an XML format. So effectively, in this case, the Rune language supports such transformation into ISO 20022 as the logic's last mile, so to speak. And that third step is currently the object of an industry-led program called Digital Regulatory Reporting, or DRR.
Right.
And that program is sponsored by the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, or were originally at inception of the CDM project before it got contributed to FINOS. And that goes back to what's the way to enact change and drive adoption across the industry. And that's where making use of the existing industry's collaboration structure, such as the trade associations, makes an absolute perfect sense, because they have decades of experience of governing, voicing the consensus questioning from the industry that goes back to the regulators. So effectively, all the guidelines and Q&As that we talked about at the beginning, they are usually being channeled in discussion between the regulators and not individual firms, but their trade association. So there is a long history of common collaboration structures that are actually doing that work. And it comes with tried and tested governance to do that. And the second aspect is that it comes with a critical mass of the members that are behind those trade associations, which are in the thousands, effectively. So it really represents the industry voice.
Okay.
So when we're talking about transaction reporting, a couple of important success points. The first one came a bit less than 2 years ago, so at the end of 2022, which was the first rewrite that was rolled out in the G20, and it was coming from the US, coming from the regulator for that market called the CFTC, the Commodities and Futures Transaction Commission, Trade Commission. And at that time, one firm went live with the DRR implementation of that transaction reporting requirement that just got rewritten, and that was BNP Paribas. So that was really the first live rollout of a new regulation rewrite. And this was actually being complied with by one of the industry leaders by making use of the DR codified interpretation of the rule.
Right.
And since then, it has been expanded to cover more jurisdictions. Greater number of firms have also rallied around this initial interpretation, and which is now covering the European equivalent and Japan, which were rolled out earlier this year in April 2024. And by the end of this year, coming in September and October, it will also be covering the UK version of the revised rule, because obviously now that the UK is outside of the EU and UK regimes can be slightly different. Singapore and Australia. So by the end of this year, we will have 6 regimes that are live in DRR, and with a critical mass of firms and that are effectively backing that consensus interpretation of the rules and actually implementing it in production to actually report those transactions to the regulators.
So we're having success, is what is what you're saying.
But it's just the start. But it's proving the point, right? Which is, this is a non-competitive part of the firm's operations.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it has every merit for being managed as an industry common. And this has shown a viable path to actually execute on that, and effectively not only solving the technical challenge, that I
Mhm.
mentioned, but also solving the social challenge, which is how do you enact change for something which is as momentous, which is as voluminous, and which, even though yes, it is non-competitive for firms, in fact there is value of being part of the herd.
Right.
Equally, it is putting your compliance destiny into somewhat of a third party's hands. You have to take a little bit of a leap of faith as well. So I think it's
Right.
important to have had those initial proof points and successful proof points, as in, yeah, the firms that have actually gone live and implemented DRR are complying and complying well,
Mhm.
are very important, because it shows that not only is it a viable path, but it's a path that can make you successful in your compliance implementation.
This might open a can of worms, and maybe it's even another podcast. But so you've shown the successes of where, if I'm an individual firm, that I can, again, if I can be part of the collaboration that's going on here, then that makes sense. What about the regulatory side, the regulator side themselves? Is there any value, or do they continue to try to stay separate so that they're this, I guess, hardbound thing that you come up against in order, because they have to be there in order and have to keep things as straight and narrow as possible within the law in order to, again, achieve that compliance. Um, but where is there a regulator path into this as well, that formally, as I would say informally, we all know that regulators have been buying into open source. But formally, is there a path for regulators? Does it make sense for them to be more collaborative in order to actually make this not only easier on everybody throughout the entire ecosystem, including themselves, but also make the regulations stick better, I guess? Does that make sense?
And the answer is yes. And in fact, there are already efforts underway for regulators to be more directly involved into, if you will, rather than providing text and text, directly
Mhm.
providing code and software artifacts that firms can directly make use of. So as far as DRR is concerned,
Mm.
so the data quality problem for transaction reporting is something that regulators have been paying a lot of attention ever since they started to collect those data. So that was shortly after, well, it started in 2012, really.
Mhm.
So more than a decade of collecting what has not always been great data and trying to identify ways to increase that data quality. So an initiative like DRR is extremely welcome by the regulators from that standpoint. And they have been, let's say, they have made public statement or have been in the same room where those statements have been made,
Mhm.
where voiced their support for an initiative like that. I
Okay.
think what we can expect over time, and I don't want to start making prediction or anything, is
Right.
I think the ideal situation there is where the regulator part of the governance of the entire project, right?
Yeah.
So I think, again, that's where the open source approach and relatively open governance, etc., I think helps massively to rally the regulators on board. In some other cases, they've actually went ahead of that. So in fact, I'm trying to remember, I think it was across 2020 and 2021, the European Commission actually, they commissioned a work that was exactly looking at that, an equivalent of DRR for transaction reporting. So it was called MRER, Machine Readable and Executable Regulation, but it's
Mhm.
exactly the same idea. So they commissioned an important work to test the idea out. And interestingly, they did it in the context, again, of transaction reporting. And they actually looked at their European reporting regime called EMIR, which has just been rewritten, that I just mentioned
Right.
earlier this year. And the outcome of that work was generally a positive recommendation, to ESMA, so the European Securities and Market Authority, to invest further in that approach. And interestingly, making the normalized model that they used to support their pilot implementation was the CDM.
Nice.
Kudos to the model. The regulator actually looked at it very seriously insofar as that pilot. Another project that is looking at something similar. So this is in a different area, but also in regulatory reporting. And it's at the European level, projects that are co-sponsored by the European Central Bank and the European Banking Authority, project called BIRD, the Bank Integrated Reporting Dictionary, and IREF, Integrated Reporting Framework. Sorry for the
that's okay. I'm writing them down.
But I'm going to over-schematize. But in a nutshell, the Integrated Reporting Framework is kind of, it's your input layer. So it's your equivalent of the CDM. How do I normalize all of the business data so that I only have to collect those granular attributes once? And then from then on, I can report whatever I want in any format I want based on those inputs. So that's hence the idea of integrated reporting dictionary. Collect once, report multiple times.
Gotcha.
And again, standardizing the reporting instructions based on some common language. So that's also part of what is being looked at in the BIRD initiative. So short answer is yes. And in fact, there are projects happening right now. The only question is how and when, under what form is the regulator's involvement going to take? And B, how long will it take for that engagement to be fully formalized? So those are the two questions, but it is happening. And the public authorities, in a sense, are also self-interested in making that happen. Because as I mentioned, by doing that, not only do you increase the quality and the comparability of the data that you collect, so effectively you reinforce your own supervisory powers, you are more omniscient, you have better data, and B, by reducing the cost on the industry, then this is more money that goes back into the system, and that can be made to productive use to finance the real economy. So public authorities have a double incentive to make that happen.
Right. For Rune, what are the call to actions that you think you have in order to, again, make the project successful past you contributing into FINOS? Who should get involved? How should they get involved? What's the next steps?
So today, if you're a financial institution, large or small, I think, so look at the Rune project, look at the CDM project, look at what is done in DRR and the extent to which it's not just an idea, but it's actually something that is being rolled out in production to support processing data as sensitive as can be reporting data to regulators. And appreciate that it's real and it works. And then on that basis, talk to your stakeholders and get your business sponsors, whether they are in regulatory operations, regulatory technology, who have been struggling with cost and suboptimal processes for years, that this very neat and elegant solution, and it's actually proven. And use those two things to convince your stakeholders, sponsors internally to seriously look at it. And then the next step is, and that's where a company like us steps in, which is, okay, we can make it happen. And that's where I mentioned commercially successful by having the whole open source project itself successful, adopted, etc. It makes us commercially successful as a result as well. And our track record is effectively helping. Once firms have made the decision and they want to do an implementation, we are here to help. That's what we do, and with a combination of our expertise and our tooling to make that happen.
Cool. There's some big names tied to this project as well, that when you did the press release, this isn't in a vacuum, I guess is what I'm saying. And we can, in the show notes, we can make sure that we put a direct link to that so that people can see the release. They can see, we'll put the repo on there and everything. But yeah, this is not just two people talking about this, right? This is financial institutions are finding value already.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thank you. Again, I said it earlier that I learned a lot today, and then there are a lot of things now I have to go look up. That's regulations, Bird, IRIF, but I'm glad I got you on for talking about the contribution of Rune, but I'm really glad that I think that this will help be a nice primer to talk about regulatory challenges within this industry. And my thought is, like, the Rune part of things, that's now, and that's what we're trying to push for, but there's a lot of evergreen content here, which is just, and not just content, there's a lot of evergreen information here as far as here's where all this came from. Here's where maybe some stall points were. Here's where we're looking at pushing in the future. And if I look at this from a financial institution point of view, from regulatory point of view, from just a outside consultancy point of view, that there seem to be so many opportunities here on the business side. There are so many opportunities to collaborate. There's so many opportunities to get better. And I feel like you've outlined a lot of that. So I'm going to go start a new regulatory financial company myself.
Well, it means maybe to go back to your initial question, what do I do? Hopefully I wasn't so useless after all, and I can wear the hat of Chief Talking Officer.
Sounds good. That is a good CTO. Thank you so much, Leo. I really do appreciate your time, and it's been definitely interesting and kind of fun to track your progress as a company, your progress as CEO, and obviously talking with Manesh last year to your CTO.
The real CTO.
Oh, right. I don't know. He said he couldn't just so you know, before we did the interview, I remember last year, he said, I'm not really good at this. I've never done this before. And that man can talk. Yes, good. But thank you again for your time. And like I said, in the show notes, we'll make sure that we have links to everything with Rune related. And as you work on blog posts and other things with Rune, let's do this again in 6 months and see where we are, where we can continue to push. Because again, on the opportunity side, I see a lot of it. And let's get this out more and more to the community.
Great. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure here too. And then with that, I'm going to say good day, good night, wherever you are.